Hello, good afternoon. All right, so today we are covering the antebellum westward expansion and the Civil War and Reconstruction. All right, so please remember that the class is Mexican American history. So I like to give you context. Some of you might be familiar with it, having taken the U.S. history classes, but I assume maybe some have not. And so I want to give context to what's going on in the nation regarding, especially as it pertains to race relations and power struggles, etc. All right. So thank you for coming faithfully. So many of these names are very familiar. All right. As I get them down here to give you your extra credit, I appreciate you. So before we begin, does anybody have any questions or comments? All right. All right. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and share the screen. And I'm going to go to right here, combined westward expansion. All right. So on this one, right, from 1846 to 1848, the United States took the far west from Mexico. What you see right here, all this right here. This is Louisiana territory that was bought in 1803. It has not been through the land office to be put into 6-acre square plots, sold on auction, and with cities and counties and all that, and then statehood status. That hasn't happened yet in some of these. All right, but the U.S. is definitely on its way to inhabiting that area, and so oftentimes you hear the manifest destiny expression by Sullivan, the writer, that it's plain to see, it's manifest that it is our destiny to take over from sea to sea, and that the people that we take over will be better off for it because of our enlightened institutions, the political liberties that they will enjoy, and the economic opportunities as well, right? And so that's a very convenient little mantra. So you usually have heard of that, and you've heard of Polk and before him Tyler, because they instigated the war, both these presidents. All right. So usually when I from a student perspective, I learned about them, Senator Benton, and other war hawks at that time for the West. And it was kind of a top-down history, right? It was just these horrible politicians who did this. And I try to make the contention in number one that entire generation should not be let off the hook. So this is conflict history. This is covering the vilification of those who won, right? And trying to elicit sympathy for those who lost. So this is classic conflict history that I'm doing here. But instead of great man history and focusing on the leaders as to why things happened the way they did, I make the contention that it was the regular people. All right. So how do I try to do that? All right. Well, for one, we know from settlement, we know that there was self-interest involved for a lot of people who settled into Texas prior up into the 1830s, and then their rebellion in 1836, which I think we should go over pretty soon. But at any rate, people were living in that area, so they have a vested interest in wanting to change the flag to the Stars and Stripes, where they have squatted upon, where they've gone most of the time illegally to come and trespass and live on and try to make a life there. So you have that component. You also have the press, right? Again, that's not the people, but again, it's the press, and they are writing for the common people. And they have here the Mexican people are imbeciles, degraded by miscegenation, The Anglo-Saxon race of Americans are superior. All right. And that's the New York Herald. That's a big one. Right. And then look what Adams says, John Quincy Adams. Is there not yet enough hatred between the races which compose your southern population and the population of Mexico? Adams rhetorically asked James Polk. All right. So you have this, you have let's see here. Then I start showing elected politicians, right? So Indiana Senator Edward Hannigan, the Anglo race and the Hispanic race were incompatible, he said. Some said that the Mexican character is made up of stupidity, obstinacy, which is stubbornness, ignorance, duplicity, and vanity. Wow. Okay. Tell us what you really think, huh? And in no reasonable period could or should we amalgamate, should we integrate with the Mexican people, that we're like water and oil. We don't mix. Okay. For one, I make the contention that these elected reps are just that. They're elected. They're making it very clear where they stand. And they were repeatedly elected. Okay. So that's no excuse for the voters, for the common people. And then in addition to that, you have the let's see here, the common soldiers, right? Look what not Zachary Taylor, Winfield Scott officially complained to Washington, D.C. regarding American war crimes against Mexicans. These are the soldiers, the common foot soldiers. The war crimes would make heaven weep, like raping Mexican women in the sight of tied up Mexican men. All right. So the war got nasty. So then I talk about after the war. You have the Rodolfo Acuna, Felipe Fernandez Armesto, who's a great writer. These are like Chicano historians, and they show what happened at the end of the Mexican-American War. Anglo squatters came in, they burned crops, they shot stray cattle, they chased off vaqueros or Mexican cowboys with guns. They tore down or occupied outlying buildings, and they blocked off gates. The Arizona Hispanic town of Cieneguilla reported a priest tortured and murdered and women raped by Anglo invaders heading to the gold rush. The alcalde mayor, or Hispanic mayor of Santa Cruz, was held at knife point. Okay, and then hearing about the bandidos like Joaquin Murrieta and Juan Cortina, there was a special hatred and a special effort of vigilante violence to find them because they were Hispanic. All right. But also another thing that really loomed large to me in putting this together, and I know I have it in here somewhere, was a speech given by Henry Clay. Henry Clay opposed the Mexican-American War. All right. He was from Kentucky. He was a Southerner. And many of the Southerners had no problem. They had a long history of the whole color line with African Americans and slavery, right? But also the whole history of the West as a safety valve. I think I've mentioned that before. When you are ambitious but poor, and you don't have the same opportunities along the East Coast, you head west. That's where you go to remake yourself, and that's where you get a second chance, etc. But the problem is the West was held sovereignly by Native American tribes and by Spain and then Mexico after 1821. So, but that was no impediment, obviously, to them and to their ambitions. And so, as a Southern rep, right, you would have thought he would be for this war because they're thinking that a lot of this land will be available for Southerners to move into and to become cash crop farmers, bring slaves, etc. Right? But instead, he opposes it. And they had something tantamount to a modern kind of poll. And he saw that he was going to lose his next election. And he gave a speech whereby he was very honest and stated that while I personally oppose this war, I clearly see it as the will of my constituents to support it. So therefore, I will do their bidding. I will commit to what they want and begin supporting the war. And to me, that was huge. That was a huge example of the voters knew exactly who they were voting for, right? When they had these expansionist platforms. And then they also, put pressure, like as you see with him, with Henry Clay. They forced him to switch his stance on the war. So at any rate, then I get into Texas, right? And I talk about how the common people were at the root of this. So, excuse me, let's see here. Let's see here. The cultural context of racism must be considered relevant in interpreting the string of events that led to the dispossession of over 500,000 miles from Mexico. This dispossession demonstrates that equality of opportunity did not exist in the antebellum West, and it began in Texas during the 1830s. As did his father with Spanish authorities, Stephen Austin secured the right to establish a colony in Mexican eastern Texas in 1824 as the impresario, like the governor. Austin was given 66,774 acres. In return, the impresario and his inhabitants were to abide by Mexican law and become Roman Catholic. By 1830, the initial arrival of 300 settlers, right, had skyrocketed to over 7,000. And it was officially noted that integration and assimilation of Anglos into Hispanic culture and institution had, quote, tapered off. Okay. And so you have the arrival of Mier y Terán, a gentleman who came all the way from Mexico City to gauge how things were going in Mexican Texas. And he had dour news. He said the gringos outnumber the Tejanos, the ethnic Hispanic Texans. He said more than 10-1. The gringos are not abiding by Mexican law. A lot of them have brought slaves, even though slavery had been abolished in Mexico. They were ahead of us on that one for sure. And they also were refusing to pay taxes. There was an assimilated gringo who went by the name of Juan instead of John, Juan Bradburn Davis. And he had a customs office in eastern Texas by the Gulf, whereby he was supposed to enforce Mexican law and taxation. On more than one occasion, his life was threatened, and he reported it to the Mexican authorities. And he said, these people are defiant, they're not paying their taxes, and it's at the risk of my life trying to extract them from them. Okay. So at any rate, then what happens is you have the April 6th law after Mier y Terán's very dour report. And the April 6th law stated that for now, there will be no more American, Norte Americano, as they were called, immigrants allowed to come into Texas, that those who were in defiance of Mexican law were to be deported, right? And they made it clear again that slavery was not allowed. And they also wanted more presidios and forts, and they tried to get a group of Mexican settlers from Mexico proper to come up there and try to even up the numbers. So when the April 6th law occurred, at that point already, some of the Norte Americanos began conspiring with each other, meeting in secret, talking about joining arms in case of a rebellion and to try to extract Texas from Mexico. There was an actual attempt known as the Fredonian Revolt, and Stephen Austin helped Mexican soldiers squash that revolt. So Austin found himself in the middle. He assimilated, became Roman Catholic, abided by the law, He reported the defiant Anglos that were in his territory, and that he too said he was at times powerless to force to compel. And so he thought, as the middle guy who had been loyal to Mexico, he could be the good middleman to arbitrate this dispute over the April 6th colonization law. But when he went down, he met President Gomez Farias, and they, according to the primary sources, they had kind of an ego clash. And when he told Gomez Farias that if they didn't bend, at least on the slavery issue, that the gringos were going to fight and succeed in taking Texas from Mexico, he arrested Stephen Austin as having made a treasonous threat. So Austin, for about 15 months, was in a prison, and he supposedly let out a letter that made its way to the Cabildo, the city council of San Antonio, and stated that the Mexican authorities are not willing to compromise, take matters into your own hands. So now he has gone from trying to be that middleman to endorsing rebellion. And so then the matter that sets it off is Santa Anna's new constitution in 1836, the Bases Orgánicas. The new constitution stated that he, as president, could shut down the Diputación, the Congress, right? And remember, the legislative body in any kind of republic is the most democratic of the bodies, right? Judicial, executive, and legislative. Almost in any republic, the legislative is the most democratic. They're the ones elected by the people. So he claims that he had the power to shut it down. Then he declared that all the governors were gone of the states who had been elected by their constituents. And he contended that he alone could handpick the governors. And then, in bringing back the hated corregidor tradition of Spain, is he had deputies that the governors hired to go and check on and could override city council decisions. So really, this was a pretty draconian constitution. It gave him the power as the chief executive to do away with the democratically elected legislative body of the country. The regional governors are now handpicked, and they themselves handpick people who could override local, city, and village decisions. So at any rate, even at the time of the Alamo, you had some with flags that said return to the Constitution of 1824, because the 1824 Constitution was modeled after the U.S. Constitution. It was a federal republic, all right? But according to the Chicano historians, right, they said this was just the pretext. This was just the excuse that the Norte-Americanos were waiting for in Texas. So they began taking over presidios, military forts, and confiscating their cannon and their muskets and their guns, etc. Right? And when they did in Goliad, or not Goliad, another place. At any rate, they're in a particular city, and the guy happened to be the brother-in-law of Santa Anna himself, and he ordered them to step down, and they fired their cannon at him and his men. And so he came back and told Santa Anna, and Santa Anna's like, "All right, it's on." But before that, Santa Anna squashed the governor of Zacatecas. Zacatecas governor refused to step down, said he was elected by his people, said also that his state militia did not belong to Santa Anna's federal army, but it was his army. And so Santa Anna raised a federal army that squashed the state militia of Zacatecas. And so instead of returning to Mexico City, he gets news from his brother-in-law, and he says, "All right, I'm heading up to Texas, to Coahuila and Texas next." So as he's heading up, they're preparing for armed combat. And so at the Alamo in San Antonio, Sam Houston and the others tried to convey the fact that they were not ready to prepare themselves militarily from that spot. But the leaders there were kind of obstinate and said, "No, we're gonna dig in our heels, and we're gonna die on this hill." And that's exactly what they did. And then, in American folklore, you get Davy Crockett, you get William Barrett Travis, you get James Bowie, that the Bowie knife is named after. James Bowie had been in several duels, and one of them infamously, the two men, actually there ended up being four men, because each man's backup got involved. All four of the men ran out of bullets without sufficiently shooting and killing the other, and they resorted to knives, and they brutally, James Bowie and his companion brutally murdered the two people, and he had just a fearsome temper. William Barrett Travis, he left his family, he abandoned his family, went after another woman, and headed into Mexican Texas. And Davy Crockett, you can't say that he stood up for the Native Americans in the Trail of Tears, but a lot of his legend was just that, was just legend. And so Chicano historians, it makes them furious when, as children, we Americans are taught to revere these people, because to them, right, they're on someone else's land and they're rebelling and taking their land from them. Okay, which I understand. So at any rate, they and not only that, but William Barrett Travis, when they were surrounded by Santa Anna's army at the Alamo, he got a message out, and he made it racist. He made it more than political, right? He says, basically, this is a loose paraphrase, but he's like, freedom-loving Americans, come down here and help us wrest this land from these backward people and their tyrannical leaders. And so, like I said, he had an ethnic component to his letter, that to suggest that he, and I'm sure others, did not just see this simply as a political rebellion, but it very much separated itself around ethnic lines. All right. A couple examples of that, beyond William Barrett Travis's letter, is another one is Coahuila. Coahuila is beneath Texas, right? And the state was Coahuila y Tejas. It was Coahuila and Texas as one state together at that time. Well, when they met, the Hispanic representatives of Coahuila, when they heard, because they opposed the new constitution as well, but when they heard what happened in Zacatecas, they're like, okay, we're not willing to go that far. We don't like the constitution, but we're not going to actually like engage in treason and fight against our own military and our own government. So the Coahuilans kind of stepped down, and the Texans continue to be obstinate, right? And then in addition to that, the Seguin, Juan and Erasmo Seguin, a father and son, they narrowly escaped death at the Alamo. They were sent as messengers to try to get more people just before the fateful day of March 6th, 1836, when they were wiped out. And so they lived through the Alamo, but they were ethnic Mexicans, spoke Spanish as their primary language, Roman Catholic, all of that, culturally Hispanic, and they hated Santa Anna's new constitution, right? But the problem is that within a decade, they left Texas. They left Texas, and we have primary source evidence that shows they were disgusted with the treatment that they received, that they were in hopes that it really was a colorblind political rebellion against a tyrannical president of Santa Anna. But what they found was that so many people could not get by the color of their skin, and that no matter how loyal they had been to the Texas rebellion cause, they were seen as Mexicans by everybody in Texas after this. and they had enough of it and they left. So at any rate, that's something to think about as far as just popular participation in taking land from Mexico. Right. Yeah, there's the April Mier Tehran, the April 6th colonization law. Yeah, he asked liberty-loving Anglos to come and join the righteous fight, not just against a tyrant, but against a, quote, mongrel Spanish, Indian, and Negro race. Yikes. All right. And let's see here. If Santa Anna's archaic constitution provided some complexity to the issue of the Anglo confiscation of Hispanic lands, the Mexican-American War 12 years later was brutally clear in its unjust nature. According to historian Robert Mary, American politicians in the mid-1840s recognized, and presidential election results clearly proved, that annexation of Mexican soil was popularly embraced. The Alabama Monitor printed a warning to presidential hopeful Henry Clay that his opposition to taking Texas would cost him the presidency. I already talked about that. Okay, as he would simply be guided by public opinion. Let's see here, but not just Southerners. According to historian Mary, news reports and local political analyses suggested widespread support for annexation of this Mexican territory in Pennsylvania, New England, Indiana, Illinois, and elsewhere in the North. Okay. So at any rate, with the Mexican-American War, Tyler is the only president to be kicked out by his own party. He was supposed to be a Whig, but he voted more like a Southern Democrat. And he asked that Congress annex Texas. And Mexico had warned us, like, leave Texas alone. So they won their independence in 1836 under Sam Houston. Okay. But at San Jacinto, what they did is they did what Sun Tzu said in The Art of War, is not only get your enemy when he's vulnerable, but get your enemy when he knows and thinks he's impregnable. And Santa Anna had his army split in three. And that night, he put them all together. And he put his guard down because he thought, we're superior in numbers. Now I have all three armies together. There's no way they'll attack us. And in the early morning, while many of them were still sleeping, they were attacked at San Jacinto by Sam Houston and his rebel men. And they grabbed Santa Anna and they said, your life for Texas. And in exchange for keeping his life, he signed Texas over. So Texas was its own republic, right? For like 9 years, from 1836 to 1845. But in 1845, Tyler went against what Mexico had warned, and he asked Congress to annex Texas as a new state. Then as he left office, Polk came in and supported the same thing. And Polk started a fight over the boundary of Texas. He contended that it was the Rio Bravo del Norte, known as the Rio Grande. And the Mexican government said from Spain, it had been the Nueces River up above it, giving Mexico a little bit more land up. The problem is that I don't think that land is very fertile that they're fighting over. But I think, it was symbolic. They had to stand their ground, both sides. So the Americans sent men beyond the Nueces. So to the Mexicans, they're already in their territory. And they brought them to the Rio Bravo del Norte. And one of the cavalry units went off on some type of jaunt to inspect or whatever. And no one knows who fired first. And about 17 Americans were shot and killed off their horses. And Polk says, American blood has been shed on American soil because it was on our side of the Rio Grande. And that was enough to get Congress to declare war. Now, you had some who opposed it. You had Christian groups, both Protestant and Catholic, who opposed it. A lot of the reformers and intellectuals opposed this war. Okay. Young Abraham Lincoln opposed it. And then you also had the Irish immigrants. The Irish immigrants, no sooner were they naturalized as immigrants coming straight from Ireland, that they were drafted against their will and sent down to Mexico to fight. And so some of them ended up switching sides, and it's known as St. Patrick Brigade, if you wanted to look more into it, or as the Mexican people called it, the San Patricios. And they fought against us. And however, we ended up defeating them. I can't remember which specific battle. And we captured them and punished them for war crimes and treason. But as this war is going on, right, you had people in California. You had a guy named Lucas Graham. This guy was a troublemaker. He was a hired gun. Mexican politics in Mexican California were always contentious, like in Mexico itself. Several times you had two Mexican gentlemen simultaneously claiming to be the governor, the rightful governor of California. Oftentimes one in Northern California and the other one in Southern California. And so sometimes they would hire these gringos who were coming in large numbers to do their fighting for them. And these gringos turned on them. So you had Lucas Graham, you had Ezekiel Merritt, trying to think who else were the leaders of this band. But at any rate, before I get into that, the first group that came in through the gap of the Sierra Nevada mountains, which the Mexicans knew the gringos would come through, right? It was the primary gap in the mountain range. They sent Johann von Sutter, known as John Sutter, this Swiss immigrant who was very wealthy and very respected by the Mexican governor, to be kind of the policeman when they came in through that valley to test whether they were acceptable or not. Well, he gets a group early on called the Bidwell-Bartleson expedition. And those are just the last names of the leaders. Okay, Bidwell and Bartleson. And he asked Vallejo, that the city of Vallejo was named after, who was the Comandante General, the leader of the Mexican armed forces in California, to come and inspect them. Vallejo saw them, and Vallejo had a very cosmopolitan upbringing. He had been sent overseas. He had tutors from Scotland. He was as fluent in English as he was in Spanish. And so he was a cosmopolitan guy. So he sees these people and he looks beyond the fact that they're Anglos. And he says, you know what? I like them. He says they seem to be harmless and they seem to be enterprising. That was a word they used, enterprising. To me, it's a combination of diligent, like hard workers, and also bringing new types of modes of production to the local economy. So the Bidwell-Bartleson group kind of served, according to the Chicano historians, as like a Trojan horse, right? Oh yeah, come, let's let them inside the gates. And then not so harmless people began coming in large numbers. So at any rate, then you also had John C. Fremont. Fremont came 3 times into Mexican California. By the 3rd time, the Mexican authorities arrested him, even though he had an American military uniform on. And they knew what the repercussions could be. he contended the first couple times that, that the Shoshone Native Americans were attacking them in the Sierra Nevada, and that they were devoid of sufficient food and water and provisions. So it was necessity, he said, that brought them into Mexican California. But by the third time, they're like, we don't want to hear any excuses why you're here again. Technically, he was on a topographical mission. He was supposed to get, just like Lewis and Clark, get information about the Native Americans, about the soil, about the weather. It's supposed to be like a scientific investigation. He had scientific equipment, yes, but he also had cannon and arms. So at any rate, he goes up to the Oregon border and he meets a guy named Archibald Gillespie. And we know now that Archibald Gillespie was a spy. And he must have told Fremont that the government wanted Fremont to take advantage of the state of war and take California. And so right when hostilities began, Fremont came down. And he got help from the ruffians, Ezekiel Merritt and Lucas Graham and these other gentlemen. They kidnapped Vallejo. They evidently he was having breakfast with his daughters, still in his robe, and they came in at gunpoint and took him. And so the leader of the Mexican Army of California was kidnapped right off the bat, and was of no help for the Mexican people. And then Chicano historians talk about how they're not happy about how in Monterey and in San Francisco, the Chicano people scarcely even put up a fight. And I don't begin to know, from what I read, they talk about malaise, right? That they were just like, there'd been so much drama in Mexican government there up to this point that they're all just tired of it all and just kind of fatalistic. They're also overwhelmed right there on the coast by large naval frigates bringing, hundreds, if not thousands, of soldiers in aboard on the coast. But Southern California put up a good fight. Southern California, they asked for the help of John C. Fremont. He lost a couple battles, and then he got the help of a guy named Stephen Kearny, who came through New Mexico from the east by land. With the help of Kearny, the Americans captured LA. They declared it under the American flag. And then there was another rebellion as they were trying to occupy it. And so then they declared martial law. So they declared the right to shoot on sight anyone. They had a curfew law, and things got bloody and contentious in LA. And so, at any rate, that was known as the Bear Flag Revolt during the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 48. And America was just very fortunate militarily. For one, they had a superiority of technology. The Mexican people thought they had the high ground at a place called Cerro Gordo. And overnight, they had a steel ramp bring up cannon up such a steep hill that the Mexicans were flabbergasted the next morning how anybody could have made that possible. So technology won at Cerro Gordo. Poor decisions made by Mexican leaders. An example will be Buena Vista. At Buena Vista, Zachary Taylor up in the north, he's attacking from the north, and Winfield Scott came in by sea to Veracruz in the south. And Winfield Scott ranked higher, so he took a lot of Zachary Taylor's men. So Zachary Taylor was outnumbered 3-1 by the Mexican forces in the north. And he knew that. So he fought defensively, and he tried to use his superior artillery and so forth. And so he built a system of 3 trenches to fall back into. They were back into their third and final trench and were running out of ammunition when Santa Anna stopped and left Buena Vista. He had no idea how close he was to winning. He said his men were tired. He was tired of seeing how many men of his were dying, and they needed to recoup and get supplies. But again, if you only knew. Then you had a case in like Monterey, or one of the places, or Saltillo, one of the cities up in the northern desert states like Coahuila and Chihuahua, etc. But there was a case where one guy ran out of ammunition, and he asked for ammunition from another gentleman, and the guy refused because they had personal animosity between each other. I kid you not. So the Americans came in, they surrendered, and they said, hand over your ammunition. And the Mexican leader said, if I had ammunition, you wouldn't be standing here. So sometimes Mexican leaders wouldn't even help one another during this war. And so, and then also what's of note, usually when you read about the Mexican-American War, is the way that Winfield Scott walked on eggshells in Mexico City. He was afraid of a rebellion. He was afraid of getting swallowed up in that big city. And so he enacted strict laws from his soldiers. And when there were cases where some of his soldiers went out to like a cantina and were like shot or stabbed to death, with two witnesses saying that he did something to deserve it, he had no punishment for the Mexican people. With two witnesses, he had a group of American soldiers publicly hanged, some of his own men, hanged publicly for the Mexican people to see, for raping Mexican women, to let them all know that he did not approve of that. And he made his soldiers go to mass there in Mexico City. And so at any rate, and then lastly, what usually is talked about in discourse in the Mexican-American War is that the decision to take everything above our current border, but nothing below, right, of Mexico proper today, was largely a racist decision, not humanitarian. And we know that from the notes of Congress, where they contended they did not want the economic burden of carrying on more land than they already took, and that they did not want to, quote, amalgamate. They did not want to integrate this, quote, brown, bronze, Hispanic race of people into the Union. Right? So then number two is Turner's thesis. Turner's thesis is pretty simple. It is that the conditions in the West renewed American meritocracy. The conditions in the West renewed American meritocracy. Remember, meritocracy, right, is you get what you earn. You rise or fall economically by your own effort and talent, right? So he contends that up to this point on the East Coast, he does like a bifurcation, a contrast. He says in the East Coast, it was who you know. It was what family name you have. It was what connections you had. But he said the West offered a completely new, clean slate for everybody. And he said that the dangers as well as the opportunities were indiscriminate. It didn't matter the color of your skin, your gender for that matter, your family name, your wealth, etc. So, for instance, dying of epidemics, right? Cholera, dysentery were big ones. The rivers, the Platte River, the Columbia River, the Snake River. A lot of people drowned in those rivers. Going over the Great Plains, freezing temperatures at some times of the year with little game to find and feed from. Or you can get gored or stampeded by roaming cattle or buffalo. And then you also had people that were ready to get the drop on you, as the parlance was at that time. When you're down in a deep canyon, they get up on big rocks and point guns at you, and they extort you. Say, give us what you have in your wagon and walk off, or we kill you right here and now. Because there wasn't, quote, law and order. Remember that according to the Northwest Ordinances that we created in our Confederacy, our first government that failed before our republic now, the Founding Fathers issued the Northwest Ordinances, whereby they put everything under 6 acre square plots. So many of those make a county, so many of those make a city, so many of those make a state. Everything is to be methodically worked out into transforming this raw territory into a state incorporated into the Union. Well, a lot of this area across the West was not incorporated yet. And then, matter of fact, Polk, when he received that famous gold nugget from Governor Mason, he declared the Northwest Ordinances void in this case, and said, just go trespass. Whoever gets it first gets it, as far as the gold. So he deliberately created a mad dash there into California. So when you have no legal institutions, that includes a sheriff or police department. So you had people all the way from Oklahoma hiring deputies, and these marshals, sent them all the way to California in these areas to take people dead or alive back to justice, because there was no legal police system yet there. And then, of course, you have vigilantism, where you had hanging trees in a lot of the gold mining towns. They would form these miners' associations, and if you were guilty of certain crimes, they would try you and convict you and punish you. So at any rate, to Turner, that makes it all the more romantic, because he kind of employs Darwinian thought and says that the weak were weeded out, regardless of their demographic, that you had to overcome these tough obstacles, but anyone could. Okay. And then as far as the equality of opportunity, the main one that I think of is entrepreneurial, starting a business of some sort. The Mormons ferried people across a few of the main rivers and charged each party for ferrying them, and made an enormous amount of money. What was his name? The name is eluding me. He was another Mormon gentleman. Sam Brannan got a virtual monopoly on shovels and picks and sold them at high prices to the miners, and made a fortune, and never had to go to a mine himself. Right? So like mining the miners, so to speak. And then you also had cattle towns. They were mainly in Kansas. That's as far as the railroad stretched from the east to the west. And people were taking the wild cattle, which President Rutherford B. Hayes declared open season as long as they're not branded by someone else. And at one time, like in 1872, you could get $75 for a head, a full-size bull. $75 back then. So people were going up the Chisholm Trail of Texas and going on these cowboys going on these long drives, making it to these cattle towns to sell them and put them on the railroad and have them sent to Chicago, where they were butchered and prepared for consumption and sold on the East Coast. So, of course, you had mining opportunities. the gold rush of 1848, the silver rush in Nevada of 1861, and the gold rush in the Dakotas in the mid 1870s. And so if you're there quickly enough, you get it. So that's his thesis. Okay, is that the West renewed American meritocracy. You had to be tough, you had to be smart, you had to be lucky, but it didn't matter your background. It was all a new world in the West. All right, so now the treatment of Hispanics. Under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that ended the war on February 2nd, 1848, Mexican Americans, right? The saying is that they didn't cross the border crossed them, right? The ones that were here already, and this was Mexico, and now suddenly it's under Los Estados Unidos. So now these Mexican Americans are guaranteed their citizenship rights, including property rights, under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. However, racist Anglo politicians in California, in Texas, in New Mexico, they began making it difficult for the Chicano people to keep that land. For instance, they would sometimes demand latitude and longitude lines on a piece of paper, permanent boundary markers, a date and a signature from the rightful governor of that region at that time. And a lot of the Mexican people didn't hold on to that. They had no idea that they would need to. And so then not only that, is from the Jacksonian era, 10 years before, the Democratic Party wanted to get votes from poor, ambitious whites. So they began encouraging squatters' rights, the rights for people to squat on territory that is being unused or unoccupied. And if they stay on it and if they improve it, it's theirs. So the problem is with a lot of the Mexican owners here in California, is they were pastoral. They weren't farmers, right? You clearly see when someone's cultivating the soil with some crop, but when they have sheep, cattle, horses that are just roaming, you could contend that, okay, these are roaming animals and I don't see fences and I don't see any cultivation of this land. So like a moth eating up, holes through a shirt in a drawer, they just started eating up this spot and this corner and that corner of the Hispanic landowners' lands. And that included Vallejo. Right. And then of course you had gringo judges who got to arbitrate and decide when there were issues over land possession. And then a sad one is there was a guy named Richard King in Texas, and there was a cattle ranch known as the Espiritu Santo, right? The Holy Spirit in Spanish, ranch. Well, he kept taking them to court for their land. And supposedly the Hispanic gentleman, leader of the Espiritu Santo plantation, saw him at the back of the court and shows him the paper and says, darn well that I own this land rightfully. And Richard King smiled at him and said, I know. He says, but I'm going to keep taking you to court until you go broke. So lawyer fees were exponentially high. And some of the rich took advantage of that. Then in the midst of the gold rush, There is evidence of Hispanics being kicked out of the city of Sonora. They were blamed for a murder of an Anglo miner, and they were given an ultimatum of 24 hours to get out of the city of Sonora or die. There's evidence of Hispanics being kicked out of Mariposa mines as well. And then they issued a foreign miners tax against Hispanics. So they had to pay a high tax to be able to mine. Right. So any questions? Sorry, I'm writing down a name that I hadn't noticed. All right. So then moving on. And then you also had lynching. So what I contend here, and it's shown better in the next number, is a term is used by some Chicano historians called proletarianization, right? Remember, Karl Marx, the proletariat are the manual laborers who work with their hands and do the menial, low-paid, hard physical jobs in an industrial new economy. Okay. They contend that the Hispanic people were pigeonholed into the proletariat. So actually, physically, there was a glass ceiling. They didn't have to have laws like they did with the foreign miners tax. That was very overt, right? But they didn't have to have laws to just simply state or just simply refuse loans to Hispanic people to start a business. As far as working in the mines, on ranches, on commercial farms, they never seemed to get raises nor advancement up the chain. And then ideologically, culturally, they were seen as being ignorant, uneducated, and that's where they belong, is working with their hands and doing the grunt work that nobody else wants to do. That's what I mean collectively as pigeonholed into the proletariat. So some companies like to exploit them because they were such hard workers. So you had the Kansas and Topeka Railroad. You had the Anaconda copper mines. They were really big on hiring Hispanic workers, but they didn't treat them worth a darn. And there was little, if any, advancement. So how did they respond to this proletariatization? Well, for one, they fought within the system. There was a very vocal Hispanic mayor of Tucson, Arizona that got national attention. His name was Esteban Ochoa. Vallejo here in California continued to be elected into office after the American takeover of California. You had also those who fought within the system of trying to compete with Anglos and sometimes even cooperate with Anglos in making money. And again, the state where I've read the most on that is New Mexico, near Santa Fe. You had some well-to-do Mexican businesses. So some fought within the system, politically or economically. Some fought beyond the system, like Joaquin Murrieta. He's the source of the story of Zorro. Okay. He was supposedly making a point, fighting against the gringo establishment. He was not just a brigand, a robber. And then you had, what I thought was interesting, I've read of them in books, but I've yet to read a book just on them, which I would love to do. But the Gorras Blancas, right? The white hats. The Gorras Blancas, they ran people for office. Again, they had the most success in New Mexico and some in Texas. And they also would engage in extra legal fights. Like, for instance, they would take pictures with themselves cutting barbed wire. Barbed wire came in 1873, and it was a symbol of the rich, right? Keeping people from grazing their animals on their property. And so they would cut through it. You had the salt mine war in New Mexico. The salt mine would belong to an entire village. And some of the Gordas Blancas got involved in that fight and actually had shootouts. So they fought both legally and extra legally. Right. And then you also have the fact that Hispanic people maintain their culture very well, very successfully. I read a book on miscegenation, Hispanic and Anglo marriages with children. And the overwhelming evidence was that the children were almost always brought up Hispanic, especially when the Hispanic parent was the mom. All right. And then number 4 is just Marxist history. It's that corporations won the West. So notice the one we just read says, no, I beg to differ with Turner in his thesis. This equality of opportunity, I don't see it for Hispanic people. And by the way, we could have done a section on the Asians, on the Chinese immigrants, to show the same message. And then, of course, the economic component. This one says, I don't buy that American meritocracy was renewed in the West. Big business, major capital, corporations won in the West just like they win everywhere else. So, for instance, they could buy the most land. With capital, they could start off with more machinery and more workers, whatever they're doing. If they can convince the government that what they're doing is best for the entire country, then they get subsidized. They get economic help from the federal government. And of course, the main example I'm thinking of are the railroads. So you had a place called Muscle Slough in Southern California. And these squatters, poor squatters, claimed land that no one seemed to be claiming. So a local judge gave it to them. And they began farming, built cabins, etc. Until the Topeka and Kansas Railroad came through. It said, excuse me, move over. They said, oh no, we have a judge's permission to reside here. It's our property now. And they said, we don't care what your local judge says. We have federal Congress saying we have a mile of land on each side of our tracks that belongs to us. And our tracks are coming right through your property. Well, the squatters refused to leave, and they had to bring in a contingent of soldiers. First, they brought in a marshal and a deputy, and they shot at him. And then they had to bring soldiers to militarily get them off the land. And of course, the rich won. The railroad guys won. Most of the mineral wealth that was extracted from the mines was deep, deep within the mines, much too deep to attain by hand. So they had pneumatic and hydraulic drills that were like as big as an oil derrick. Who could afford that? A corporation. And then farming, you have uh, the harvester, the reaper, the combine, uh, the thresher, and these new kind of tractors, if you will. Only the corporations could afford those. It could outproduce you with their farm produce. And then I do mention the exploitation of the Chinese here. All right. So look what I have at the end there. Turner's thesis conveniently omitted such facts to hide an ageless reality that even in the far West, those with more money and connections gobble up their smaller competitors and keep their laborers from rising. All right. So now what I'm going to do, try to be faster on this one. So remember this in light of like what we'll cover next with the Hispanic, with the Mexican Civil War, etc. Is supposedly America is trying to deal with the color line problem, and this is the romantic image that we received as children during the antebellum generation. That was just antebellum, just means before the war, and the Civil War was 1861 to 65. So we're talking about like the 1830s, 1840s, and 50s. This new antebellum generation was just out of the ordinary. They had all kinds of reforms. They had all kinds of intellectual movements. They had lyceums. Lyceums were like intellectual fairs where people would come up and speak on a myriad of different topics for the people to, learn, especially people that don't have access to a college education. You had the transcendentalists said that everybody ought to be free and open to transcend their material, empty lifestyle and find out their meaning of life. And when they said everyone, they meant everyone. They included African Americans and women, etc. They had jail or prison reform. They had child labor reform. They had anti-alcohol crusade. They had urban renewal. All kinds of reforms from this singular generation. So clearly, right, they wanted the world to be better. And so for the first time, we get a breath of fresh air. They're not willing to just stay quiet about the slavery issue. They're willing to question it. And that, of course, those who went to the extremes of that were known as abolitionists. You see, there's nothing in the Constitution originally that states that the federal government, Congress, or the executive, or the judiciary, for that matter, has the power to tell Alabama to end slavery. Remember, we have a federal republic, so the states share powers. And the 10th Amendment said whatever's not given or implied to the federal government is left over for the states. So a lot of people, including Abraham Lincoln, thought that there was a huge constitutional obstacle in doing something about slavery. The abolitionists, they didn't care. They said it's immoral, it violates a higher law of humanity, and it needs to be ended everywhere. Right? They had newspapers, they had speaking tours. And now look at this. The abolitionists, a lot of them wanted to engage in moral persuasion, but some of the abolitionists actually became politicians. They were known as radical Republicans. Charles Sumner, Henry Wilson, John Andrew, John Hale. Those are all big names. Salmon Chase, Benjamin Wade, Joshua Giddings, Owen Lovejoy. Again, big names. William Seward. All right. So according to this narrative, they no longer are messing around, these new radical Republicans. They start telling the moderate Republicans, we won't vote for you, with you, on economic issues if you do not take a stronger stance against slavery. They started programs of sending literature and speakers down into the South, telling the poor white people that slavery hurts you as well, giving the jobs to the, quote, Negro slaves instead of to you as sharecroppers. And the planters don't care about you any more than they care about their slaves. So they're rocking the boat. And then you had events in the 1850s that just had a polarizing effect. They kind of push people in one direction or another. They almost made you pick a side. You had Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad. You had the Dred Scott case that said that all free states and free territories had to allow immigrants that bring slaves in to keep their slaves as their movable property, which angered a lot of anyone that's even close to an abolitionist. You had Bleeding Kansas, where they tried to let the people of Kansas vote themselves on the issue of slavery, and they ended up going into civil war. So these kind of events are like, they're polarizing. They're pushing people into two different camps. So then the war really does become about slavery. And Abraham Lincoln, there you see Frederick Douglass and Salmon Chase. Abraham Lincoln gets elected, and he stated in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, not that Douglas, a white racist Douglas named Stephen Douglas. He states that if everybody in Kansas or Nebraska were to choose slavery, he by himself unilaterally would say no to them because it's wrong. And because the founding fathers forbade slavery in unorganized territories known as the Northwest Ordinances. They said in the future states in the Ohio Valley around the Great Lakes, there cannot be any slavery. So he said, hey, they did that. We can do this with the Western territories. So when he became president, it was known that slavery could not spread anymore to the West. So 11 states left the Union. And he said, come on, guys, don't start a civil war. It's in your hands, which was very sly of him because he's making it look like the Southerners started it because he has no choice. He can't just let them leave. All right. Then revisionist history shows evidence of lots of racism in the North as well as the South. It says this wasn't really fought over slavery. Look at this. Only 5 of 19 northern states had given some citizenship rights to some African-American men by the time of the Civil War. Yikes. Congress began issuing confiscation acts. They said, okay, fine. Under English common law, you Southerners contend that slaves are movable property, known as chattel. Well, we're confiscating your chattel whenever and wherever we defeat you in battle. But when they did, they treated the black people like garbage. They made them dig the latrines, bury the dead. They didn't give them any dignity. They showed annoyance by them, with them. And then over halfway through the war, both Ulysses Grant, Abraham Lincoln, and George Julian all say that arming the slave men could give them the edge in winning. So Julian has a famous quote where he said, "You know what? I've asked you congressmen," and remember the Southern congressmen left during the Civil War. So these are just Yankees. He said, "I tried to appeal to your hearts and get you to, have some compassion and free the slaves, but you wouldn't listen to me. So now, fine, I'll appeal to your self-interest. If we don't arm the slaves, the Southerners are going to beat us to it. And if we do arm the slaves, we will terrify and divide the South. We will encourage the slaves to run away and rebel. It'll be in our best interest to free them and use them as fighters." And not only that, it was a way of making, given a sense of purpose beyond just trying to keep the country together, because the casualties mounted to such a high number. And it was a smart way of keeping England out of the war. The South almost succeeded in forming an alliance with England. And when Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which just declared slaves of rebels free, only slaves of rebels free, England backed off. Said, no, now this is beginning to look like a war over slavery, and we want nothing with the side that's supporting it. So did we have these ulterior motives? And then you have the faction thesis. Like the Free Soil Party, they were racist as can be, but against slavery. They said, don't give the job to the N-words, give them to white men instead. Have free labor. People will work harder when they have salaries. And then they said, if we have free states to the west, they'll vote the same way as us. If they're slave states, they'll vote the same way as the Southerners. It's known as the faction thesis. So this is continuing. There are ulterior motives for fighting. And then Abraham Lincoln, his alleged evolution into a saint, is that he was personally indifferent until 1838 and 1841, when he finally saw slavery with his own eyes. And he had constitutional problems, and still until he bunked with Joshua Giddings, who had his ear, and also until the Dred Scott case, which he thought was radically aggressive of the South. Then he dropped his qualms with ending slavery, and came up with the idea that it was the founding fathers' intention for future generations to get rid of slavery. And one of the greatest signs that they, in doing that, was one, the clause that said they could end the slave trade, and two, the clause that said that the necessary and proper clause connected to anything, but then also the Northwest ordinances and banning the territory of the Ohio Valley, banning slavery there. So Lincoln became more and more close to something that might approximate an abolitionist as time went on. You look at some of his quotes against slavery. At this point, Lincoln no longer cared if everyone in Kansas and Nebraska had chosen slavery. There should be no compromise in prohibiting slavery from spreading to the Western territories. And then finally, with the obstinacy, the stubbornness of the South. And then this last one right here, he likens the Civil War to God's chastisement, that God is like spanking, he's punishing the country for the sin of slavery. And that's very abolitionist-like. And then before he died, just before he died, he asked that they consider giving some citizenship rights to the, quote, Negroes in Louisiana, because Louisiana was one of the first, if not the first, state, maybe Tennessee, was one of those two, to be taken over by the North and write a new constitution and be reaccepted into the Union. But look at some of his quotes. They're interesting. Now, with this one, I'm just saying that when the going got tough, they gave up on Reconstruction. The Republicans in the South, they didn't have staying power. That things briefly looked like they were going to be great, and then they lost steam. So, for instance, after the 13th Amendment, there was, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment granted citizenship rights to anyone born or naturalized in the country, in any state, entitled to the rights, privileges, and protections of citizenship. Then the 15th said, in case it's not clear about the rights, privileges, and protections of citizenship, that includes suffrage. That includes the right to participate in politics, to run for office, and to vote. They had soldiers that stayed down in the South to carry this through. They disenfranchised all those who had made a vow in the past to defend the Constitution and then broke that vow by joining the Confederate Rebellion. For 2 years, they were disenfranchised, citizenship taken from them. So de facto in South Carolina, you had a majority of Black citizens suddenly. And then you had a large number of white Republicans that moved down to the South at the end of the war, and the Southerners hated them as parasites, so they were called carpetbaggers. And then you had some Southern progressive people, white people, who actually were for the Republican Party and the end of slavery, and they were called scalawags. So now you have this time around 1868 to 1870 that you have the hated triumvirate to the racist South. African Americans, white Republican Northerners, and Southern white Republicans. So they did a lot. They established school systems, penitentiary systems, orphanages. A lot of it was like safety net stuff for the people that like fall through the cracks of society, for the less fortunate. Hiram Revels was a Black congressman. Blanche K. Bruce, another one, who they became senators. And they did a lot for their people. Francis Cardoso was a brilliant, brilliant with budget and with math, with numbers, and had integrity. Robert Delaney, a black ex-slave, said, because of our unrequited labor, the labor that we gave and never got a cent in return, we deserve land. But that didn't stick. So the 2 years end. Now the old racist establishment are citizens again. The Southerners are tired of being taxed for all these safety net things, services. Some of the Southern governments are broke because they spent themselves into debt. And so, of course, what do they contend in the Southern press? Negro misrule has caused economic catastrophe in the South. And the white Republicans did not stand by them. They threw them under the bus and said, no, they were responsible for that. Yes, we'll be more responsible with our budgets, to try to keep themselves alive politically. The North started to lose interest. And then Rutherford B. Hayes, and trying to be chosen as the president in the House of Reps because no one got a majority of electoral points, promised to evacuate the troops from the South. One state after another, the African Americans are physically, forcefully, and legislatively written out of politics, and they establish the Jim Crow laws, whereby they're going to have to start all over again 100 years later in the civil rights movement. Number 5 is pretty easy. You can't use a political solution for a social problem. These laws were great, and they made some inroads. But the problem is in the human heart, in the human mind. As long as they are hating, despising, disdaining, fearing African Americans, then the problem is still going to be there. So I said, instead of just resting on these political remedies, there should have been more done in the social realm, like with culture. So the first group I attack is evangelical Christianity. You could find evidence that evangelical Christianity was instrumental in cooperating with the abolitionist cause in the North. It's the same reason why a lot of planters did not want to convert their slaves, because there's revolutionary potential in the Bible, talking about the equality of all people and freedom from slavery, etc. So why didn't the Southern church do that? They dropped the ball. Okay, let's see here. Then public education. The white folk just refused to send their kids, their white kids, to school with black kids when they tried integrated schools during Reconstruction. Notice I don't have a remedy for that, but yet I'm saying that the schools could have if they could have kept them together, that could have been huge in solving some of the deep, root problems of the South over the color line. And then after the church and after public schooling, I go after the intelligentsia, the writers. They drop the ball as well. Racism was never uprooted at its sources. As legislation, though it arguably constitutes a great start, has arguably never nor will ever suffice in eradicating it. Legal and institutional remedies will never suffice for a problem in the human head and heart. All right, so does anybody have any questions? I'm finally done. Okay, guys, I have all of your names. So if there aren't any questions, I'm going to go ahead and let you go, if that's okay.
Bye-bye. Have a good one.
Bye. Thank you.